What you see before you is an indigenous piece of art. And this is very important to the indigenous world. And we've just come through a month of looking at indigenous issues. And those of you who are visiting with us, we use art quite a bit in our services because it speaks to us. And it has much to say. And this is a piece by Carl Beam called The North American Iceberg. It is a collage of personal and historical photographs reflecting both European and indigenous culture and includes various inscriptions. By combining images from different periods and places, Beam brings past and present together and underscores the cultural métissage that has shaped the North American identity. Like an iceberg, that identity is largely submerged beneath the layers of a colonial past. It became the first contemporary work by an Indigenous artist ever purchased by the National Gallery of Canada, and that's where you will find this. This was the first one of contemporary Indigenous art to be purchased. Born in Manitoulin Island in Ontario, the Ojibwe artist Carl Beam first learned about Indigenous art while studying in British Columbia. His work is characterized by a combination of references to Indigenous culture and history and a graphic design style akin to pop art that recalls the American painters Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. So I wanted to share this with you because of its significance to the moment in which we live right now, as well as to the artistic history of our great land. So those of you who are visiting here with us today, the message you are about to hear comes as a result of Southminster's emphasis on Indigenous issues during the month of June, which of course was designated Indigenous Month in Canada. And of course, we continue to hear of the unmarked graves being discovered at various locations, primarily out west. And for many within the church, the burning question has become, how could this have happened within the church? We, as United Church of Canada, were involved with the residential school program, along with other churches, as well as the Government of Canada. And so this is a question that we have been dealing with for quite a number of decades. But the revelations of late continue. As you can see here, these are article headlines coming from some of the major media outlets around the world. And I have outlined in brown the numbers of unmarked graves that have been discovered. So I'm entitling this message, Residential School Revelations. How did this happen within the church? Now this is Kamloops Residential School, and you'll see on the right the number of unmarked graves that have been found. I'll just go through these quickly. And this is Maryvale Residential School in Saskatchewan, where 751 unmarked graves were found. St. Eugene's Mission School in Cranbrook, British Columbia, 182. And just most recently, Cooper Island Residential School, 160. That is what we have been hearing about of late. Now, I don't know how many of these sites, as you can see, we had 138 residential schools in Canada throughout its, as the entire existence of that program, and it remains to be seen how many actually will be found. But be rest assured, additional revelations will continue to come. Even the Honorable Murray Sinclair last month adjusted his previous estimate of 6,000 to more than 10,000 that of unmarked graves that probably will be found. So we are living in watershed moments for our indigenous peoples. There isn't any question. And of late, this is highly significant, what has just happened in the last number of weeks. And I wanted to highlight that just for a moment as we look at our new Governor General designate, Mary Simon, who's a Nook, and Roseanne Archibald, who is the new National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. These are firsts. First of a Governor General of Indigenous background and ancestry, as well as a first female National Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. Highly significant. So with the remainder of my time this morning, I hope to draw the threads together of earlier messages as it relates to our journey of faith and theological understanding as a united church, and as it relates to this burning question of how did this happen within the church. And this is a question that is on everyone's mind and everyone's lips, whether they are affiliated with a church or not. In society, that question is being bantered about quite a bit. The resource I'm using primarily today, as I have in the past, is the Reverend Dr. Lorraine Mackenzie Shepherd, and it comes from this excellent book on the theology of the United Church of Canada. And the chapter is the United Church's mission work within Canada and its impact on Indigenous and ethnic minority communities. And so this is excellent research that Lorraine has done, and I will be drawing on it quite a bit, as I will be others. Now, I will endeavor to merge this historical account with the critical analysis of Northrop Frye. Now, some of you know I've been speaking about Northrop Frye's work in messages gone by just in the last month or so. He was, for those of you who don't know, he was a 20th century Canadian literary critic and theologian, actually was United Church clergy. And I had introduced some of his thinking a few weeks ago. So what I hope will emerge for you is how Frye's open and closed thought structures are in evidence as the theology of the United Church evolved since the Union in 1925. Now, for those of you who are listening from St. Giles and Glebe St. James and 4th Avenue Baptist, let me provide a rudimentary frame of reference for you with respect to Frye's open and closed thought structures. What exactly does this mean? And I'll just a little bit of a primer to help you. First of all, open thought structures means that they are inclusive of the other. There is an openness to integrating new ideas into one's own thinking, and they're not intimidated by those who would necessarily be different from oneself. So inclusivity, integration of new ideas, and not intimidated by difference. Closed thought structures, on the other hand, are exclusive in nature. Belief in a closed structure would be likened to a creed or what others believe like you do. But how that belief is acted out in one's actions and one's attitudes is critical to these types of structures. And what they would say within a closed thought structure is one's ideas must conform to the group. And if not, they must be dismissed as lacking credibility. And if these ideas persist, they must be suppressed. That's what you would call a closed thought structure. Now, Frye often called them mythologies, but we're using the term thought structures. That works a lot better. Thank you very much, Carol. Now, so on June 13, I brought a message on our historical context during the opening decades of the 1900s. I used this as a backdrop to try to better understand the mindset of the times from a societal perspective. And undoubtedly, the church, not just the United Church, was not immune to those societal norms. So we're talking about pretty much a century ago. So what we are about to hear was not only evident in the church, but it was at the time, but it was prevalent in mainstream Canadian society as well. And as Southminster knows, I'm a believer in placing my remarks in context. I think that is hugely critical in terms of comprehension. It's always advantageous to grasp a sense of the times that one is referencing. Now, one of the things I'm going to be doing in the next week is that I'm going to be using a YouTube channel, and some of these messages that I've been bringing, I'm going to place them on this channel. They'll be a standalone message. That's all that will be there, and there will be a link on our website that will take you to the YouTube channel with the title of the message and the time, the date. So I think that might be of help. Now, let me continue. Now, evidence of closed thought structures in the United Church, or this thing of exclusivity, we see this in exclusive language and orientation in the opening decades of the United Church of Canada. With respect to our attitudes toward the Indigenous, these structures were in evidence through the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, and weren't acknowledged in earnest as a denomination until the early 1960s. There were those who still held to referencing the Indigenous peoples and culture as savage. That's a word that you find in writing, in church documentation of the times. They used language citing the supremacy of the white race, and that Indigenous needed to be civilized and taught Christian moral standards. Their ceremonies were cruel heathen rites that needed elimination. This, unfortunately, was part of the thinking in the early part of our church history. Now, they didn't initially understand that First Nations were nations in and of their own right, with their own land, cultures, languages, and religion. We just didn't get it. We didn't see it. They didn't realize that forms of dress, communal sharing, governance, personal interaction, and relationship to the land and all creation were aspects of a different culture to be respected. So the church confused cultural differences with what it believed were bad habits requiring eradication. This is part of our history. We have to own that history. Now, with respect to other world religions, let me say this. Closed thought structures were quite pronounced at the time of church union in 1925 and on into the 20s, lasting up into the close of the mid-1940s. Mohammedanism, or what we would call today Islam, and Hinduism were viewed as formidable foes, as cited in the early documentation relating to church union in 1925. And here's quite a startling quote. "The carpenter of Nazareth is still building coffins for the dead and dying religions of the world." 1929, that comes from the United Church of Canada yearbook, page 145. With the prevalence of this kind of thinking and toward other world religions, it becomes quite conceivable that the Indigenous were viewed in a similar light, if not worse. So Fry's open thought structures begin to emerge concurrently during these early years of the church. And so we begin to catch a glimpse of a theological shift, a move toward more open thought structures and inclusivity in theological thinking and writing. The beginnings of a norm change within the church, and hopefully that's reflective of society. I think we were a bit ahead. First of all, you had the brotherhood of man. I realize that that's exclusive language, but the intent is inclusive. And that the church officially begins to condemn racism and growing anti-Semitism in the 1930s. And the church conceded that general revelation and identified values within what was termed as ethnic faiths could be held in common with Christianity. So when we think of open thought structures, these values were evidenced in the general revelatory work of the Holy Spirit through men of God who followed other religious traditions. Again, I'm using the language of the time. So there was more of an openness to recognizing God in other faith traditions, whereas prior to that, it was not the case. This still ran counter to the beliefs enshrined in the doctrinal section of the Basis of Union in 1925, that revelation through Jesus Christ was the unique and sole source of redemption, which left no room for human beings elsewhere whose hearts sincerely sought after and cried out for God of ever finding that relationship. Those who were endeavoring to follow God's precepts. So this thinking ruled out the possibility that God, in God's own compassion, would ever reach out to those individuals and shed abroad in their hearts the love of God's self and for humanity. And sadly, during those years, the 20s through the 50s, the Indigenous of Canada continued to experience the harshness that such exclusivity engendered. The recognition of common noble values afforded other global faith traditions were not extended to the Indigenous. They simply did not. Rather, they remained in the view of the church primitive and animistic. These beliefs remained something to be discouraged and eradicated if possible. Recent reports reveal also that from 1942 to 1952, actual nutritional experiments were conducted in residential schools among hungry Indigenous children. Hard to believe. I think it's fair to say that fear and xenophobia were exacerbated during the war years, both in Canadian society in general and within the church, which contributed to the United Church of Canada's support of the government policy to intern the Japanese living in Canada during the war. Let's look at that. The WMS, Women's Missionary Society, helped to solicit employment and provide education for them, meaning the Japanese, but did so with the belief that internment was appropriate and that any Japanese who was a true Christian would carry no resentment nor bitterness over that evacuation. My, oh my. However, I will hasten to add this, that once the church realized what the government was up to at that time, and this is what they were doing, confiscating the property of the Japanese, preventing them from owning or leasing land, blocking Japanese from their own professions, refusing to provide them with primary and secondary education, and keeping them interned in deplorable housing, and refusing their offer to enlist and offer blood donations. Once this became apparent, the United Church of Canada as a denomination reversed its commendation and protested these discriminatory actions. In 1944, the United Church acknowledged that racist fear was growing not only in Canada but within the church itself. And the Board of Home Missions detected a smugness, exclusiveness, and prejudice in the church toward the non-Anglo-Saxon, primarily British. Of course, following the horrific revelations of the human rights violations during World War II, in 1945 came the United Nations Charter, and in 1948 the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And the Board of Home Missions condemned the sentiment of many United Church clergy and their members who agreed with the wartime refusal of refugees, largely based on Anglo anti-Semitism. It says this: recognize racism and anti-Semitism as sinful acts that betrayed the gospel of hope for the brotherhood of man. Now, this is as far as I'm going to take you today, and I'll finish this up next week. But what I hope you will begin to sense is the tension during these early years of the church between what Fry calls an open and a closed thought structure. And you begin to sense this emerging norm change that took place. The ebb and flow, the oscillation and seesaw effect as more progressive thinking within the church began to make its presence felt. It would be a number of decades beyond church union in 1925, and for that matter, a few additional decades beyond World War II before progressive thinking found its place of prominence and rootedness within the structures of the church, its courts, and congregations. So what I want to hope to accomplish through this brief analysis and historical overview of the United Church is to not excuse the church's involvement. As I said earlier, we have to own that part of our history and take responsibility for any actions. But what I hope to achieve is to provide for us a backdrop to better comprehend how such things came to pass. And in that sense, as we grasp that better, I believe that we can give a better account of ourselves when people ask those questions. So I think it's important no matter what your faith tradition is, that you understand your faith tradition. You know its histories, okay? Its strengths and its weaknesses. And I want to close with this slide. That's today. And obviously you know what each one of those candles represent. Oh God, we praise you this day for your graciousness to us. You have not left us bereft and without a roadmap for life, but you have provided us with signposts for our religious journey. Continue to be our guide on our way and lead us to a Christian life which is characterized by authenticity. Lead us in those times when there is disconnect in our lives between what we profess and what we live. Those times when we are hearers of the word but not doers. Lead us in those times when we are quick to cut people off and refuse to hear them. Lead us in those times when we have not carefully weighed what to say but jump to quick and erroneous conclusions and blurt out a hasty and unkind response. Lead us in those times when we are quick to anger and unaware of the hurt which often lies behind our anger, thus making difficult the possibility of reconciliation. And Lord, lead us in those times when the walk we walk does not correlate with the talk we talk. Help us to be doers of the word and not hearers only. Help us to hear the cries of the needy. Help us to be peacemakers in a world which is so characterized by and so familiar with war. Help us to be hopeful people wherever we find despair, and help us never to flag in zeal or become weary in well-doing. Help us to take seriously our mission to the sick, the dying, the disadvantaged, and all those places of the earth where you still call to us through the cries of your children. Help us to be faithful, O God. Let us share the Lord's Prayer. It is as it is found before you. Our Father and Mother who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.